Deborah Solomon, live from the Whitney in 2018. Thank you for joining me. Soon I'm going to eat some pecans. They're toasting. In the meantime,
Sure. I think she's really first rate.
And I think one of the reasons she left
helps too, right? That helps.
I think one of the reasons she left in the late 50s is that she was essentially as bombastic as she could be, and as wild and challenging as she could be personally. She was basically very shy. And when the art market turned into a situation where you had to try to sell yourself as much as your art, that was part of Grace's reason for leaving too, is that she suddenly became part of the product. She had to be on show. She had to make the scene as Grace Hardigan, the artist, not just someone working in their studio and their paintings speak for themselves. And when Joan saw the direction that the art world was going, she just wasn't prepared for it psychologically. She just didn't care to be part of that. But there was a pure kind of, let's say in Europe, you could just be an artist. She would say, you don't have to explain what that means. And so she could retreat into her work and create and not be bothered by the salesmanship part of it.
Well, now that I think about it, I think they all left New York at the end of the 50s because Lee was out in East Hampton. She came back, though. She came back to Manhattan. And
Elaine moved.
Where was Elaine? She was teaching
all
over the
world.
She left, too.
Yeah, and then she came back.
And who's the fifth
one?
Helen. And Helen was here.
Yeah, she was
very
here.
Much
she was
here.
Uptown.
Upper East Side.
Yeah. Upper Bohemian.
Yeah.
So I mean, everything changed, and that's when, unfortunately, when the art world became the art market and business became what painting was all about, buying and selling.
Say something in the chat. What's up?
But they continued to do good work.
What's interesting is their work.
Lee's work, I would say, got better in the 60s. I mean, it's not, they could distance themselves from the market. Right. They had suffered through the lean years.
Yeah.
She had studied with Hans Hofmann. She knew more about European modernism than anybody else that generation. She's often given credit for introducing Pollock to Picasso, meaning Picasso's work, not the person. And so, of course, she was grounded. And I don't think that she was, I don't think that the market changed her life at all, except to make her more financially comfortable. I think that, and of all those artists, Joan Mitchell certainly not ruined by the market.
No, but what I was going to say is that it became more difficult for most women at the moment when art was valued for its price tag as opposed to the quality of the painting. Most women fell off the map at that point. People often ask me what happened to, if this was a moment when women were recognized for their art, like this image is from the Life magazine piece. What happened? Where did they go? And where they went was, pop. And collectors stopped buying women, and museums stopped requesting, that women's work be donated, and critics stopped writing about them. I mean, some of the people here, like Barbara Tuchman, is one of the few women who kept those women alive for us, for the likes of.
But which women?
For any of these women. I mean, you yourself, your interviews with Lee through the years, or Barbara Rose's interviews with Lee through the years. If it hadn't been for your work, I wonder sometimes where they would have gone. They would have been fine.
I don't see it as that dire. I think what's interesting is, reading your book, I realized that the museums were more supportive of them than critics. The real problems were their fellow artists, their husbands, and Clement Greenberg. You talk about how he would rail against women artists. He really thought women were inferior artists, that they polished their work too much. The work had too much finish. They didn't know when to end a painting. He made it sound like they were polishing a table with lemon pledge, the way he described the painting. And then when Helen had her show, I was fascinated by the criticism. People said that because she poured paint and created these beautiful veils of color, there was no sign of struggle.
Yes, isn't that amazing?
Which is really interesting. So they use that as a way to attack her. The work is too surfacey. It's not about smearing. It's not about erasing. And then later on, that becomes a mark of genius among other artists who avoid this great metaphysical struggle in their work. But so I think the artists, I I think they paved the way for a lot of artists who came afterwards. There were quite a few women who painted in that era, compared to earlier eras. I mean, if we go back before Lee, you have George Mary Cassatt.
Right. They were Indians, but really, I think the idea of women being professional artists really arose in the WPA with Lee, and because they were getting the same paycheck as men, and they were in it, and they were all treated the same. They were interchangeable. So I think that's where it came from, and so there was a beautiful kind of 20-year period.
Interesting. And maybe the art world, like the rest of the world, just had to wait for the 70s and the women's movement and the idea that men could help at home, help raise children and wash dishes, right? Whenever I think of carpeting, this is slightly to the side, but not completely. When I look at old magazines and see all the ads for carpet and carpet cleaners, I think women who had a vacuum couldn't get anything else done. It's like it really held them back. And then they got rid of all the carpet. Look what women did. But no, I think that now when there are so many women artists and women who have, I think, probably much less difficult lives than your pioneers. People have many women artists have children now, and that really seemed to be almost an impossibility. In the 50s.
I think it was.
Why is that? Why do you think?
Well, I think that the life was basically so difficult, and to split your time between raising a child and trying to create art, and plus, the art world that they lived in. I mean, it was difficult enough to be a woman artist, but to be a mother, impossible.
And they didn't have enough money for help, really.
Yeah, and where would you put a child? I mean, when Grace brought her son to her loft with Al Leslie, in this place, this camping space on the Lower East Side, that's not a way to raise a child. Do you remember the anecdote with Louise Nevelson where, I think I use it in the book, I'm not sure, but a critic actually stated in 1944 that I was glad to learn that this was done by a woman, because otherwise I would have declared this work to be done by a master. So in other words, he was saying, so if that's what a woman was up against, then just think what a mother would have been up against. I mean, you would have been written off. But and
most of the men of that generation did not have children either.
Yes.
I mean, I think the only parents were Jack Tworkov was always kind of cited as a great father.
Ibram Lassalle.
Lassalle, and Rothko had children. But many of them were too poor to think about raising a family. And in many cases, the wives supported the husbands, like Annalee Newman, of course.
But as to your point about the 70s and women today and, this kind of wave, just as the feminist movement comes in waves, just the social feminist movement, so too does the recognition of women artists come in waves. And I think we're at a point now that someone said to me, which I think was a really excellent point, that, prices there have been new records set for women's work, and there's a new focus on women's work. But for that to remain, for that not to then go its inevitable dip, there has to be a real shift in the way women are treated, that they have to be taught in art history courses, and they have to be shown in museums, and that they have to become part of the discussion.
Well, I feel like the market, this might be naive, is a whole nother issue. I don't really think about the market that much.
Well, that's great, but unfortunately...
You wrote on Marx, so you probably have a more Marxian view
it's
with
funny
the
because
market and the art. I feel like that most artists are untouched by the market, first of all.
Because they're not selling?
Because they're not in the auctions to begin with.
Right.
So, I mean, this is just like, to me, the auctions are like this cartoon strip that runs along the edge of the art world that involves like 30 artists. Most people are not touched by it. And for those who are touched by it, many of them remain really insulated from its more pernicious effects.
Yes.
I mean, I think we can think of many people whose work sells well and who really seem to be digging as deeply into themselves as they ever were. So I don't see the market as necessarily being compromising. I think it's compromising for other reasons. I think it's wounding for artists because it's, I just can't believe looking through auction catalogs that you could see what everyone is worth. Imagine if writers had their advances published. I mean, that's a very demeaning structure in a way. It's like horse races. What is your value? And it's annoying because people outside the art world think that price actually reflects on talent. I don't think it does.
No, it doesn't. And you're absolutely right. And if a person is a real artist, they're going to create no matter what, if anybody's looking at their work. But the point is that for people getting in, artists paint to show their friends or their family or hopefully at galleries. And for those gallery doors to open, there has to be someone at the top. There has to be someone at the top of the heap that is sort of paving the way, that it's the road to Oz, so that you get in the gallery and you can work through that system. And I agree absolutely that the creation of art and the selling of art are two different things, and they shouldn't actually influence one another. But I think, in fact, they do. And I think that, there's a moment now where maybe there's a leveling off. There was someone at the Frankenthaler Institute yesterday who, a young woman who was a painter, and it was so refreshing because she said that there's not really a difference now in galleries at her age, at her stage, between men and women. Great. Isn't that wonderful? But
prices, you're right. Men get much more at auction. I think the only female artist who really is in that stratosphere is Cindy Sherman. And women do lag behind. But I wouldn't. I feel
they are two different things.
I don't see that as a terrible injustice. I just see that as part of the bias of a market that might not really even understand which art is the most interesting.
No, and it won't. And we'll find out 40 years from now who was the most interesting artist.
Because the injustice is not that some artists aren't selling paintings for $100 million, that women artists aren't selling. The injustice is, are they represented at the Museum of Modern Art? That's much more important.
Yes.
Do they have gallery representation? Do critics take them seriously? And reading your book, I was aware that even the female critics of the era were writing about men, like Barbara Rose, who we both adore, was writing mostly about male artists, minimalism. And Dori Ashton also wrote a lot about Rothko and Custon, and these women did not have their champions. They didn't have champions.
Well, Dori Ashton was a big champion of grace. She really loved grace, and she, couldn't understand why she fell off the map. But I think it became kind of a loop, that critics write what's being shown, and if women aren't being shown, they're not writing about women. And if a woman's not in the gallery,
well, look at Clem. Helen was showing, and Clem didn't write about her. I mean, you look at his book from 1960, Art and Culture. They had been dating for a decade. And there are endless references to Pollock and everyone else in the book. But I think that the male critics, or you look at Jansen's History of Art.
It has 14 women in now or something. For a long time it had none.
So, a lot of this, I think, does have to do with the critics, the scholars, the husbands. As opposed to dealers. Dealers will show anything that can sell.
Yeah, but they'll sell what people want, and
that's
people
true.
don't know what they want until they've been introduced to it. And so it's a vicious cycle. All I'm saying is that we're at this point right now. So let's keep it there.
Yeah, no, we're at this very strange moment where galleries are really trying and museums are trying to be more inclusive. Society as a whole wants to be more inclusive. And there are endless debates about this. Is the quality of art being compromised? Or do we want to be a more inclusive society? This is the way the argument is often framed. And I think we're at a great moment. The big thing in the art world now is revisionism. We're looking back and seeing how we can expand the canon. And so what if we overlook a Kenneth Noland for 5 minutes? They'll be back. It's nice to focus on
really
women and minorities, I think, right now. I think that does.
That's a really good point. And that's something that I think is so critical, because oftentimes people will say, well, in focusing on women, you're ignoring a lot of good men. I don't think that there's, art appreciation is like a heart. That heart can have enough love in it for everybody. And so can art appreciation. You don't have to have a very small world. It's not either or. You can like everyone, or you can at least at least be introduced to as many people as possible.
Well, the fashion now definitely is for women artists, I think, and minority artists. If you look at the exhibition calendars at the museums this year, and I think it's a moment of cultural reckoning.
Yeah.
That reflects a larger cultural reckoning that seems to me generally like a force for good. And I think the people who argue that this represents somehow a dipping in quality, as critics used to argue, it's just an old formalist argument that doesn't hold up. I mean, there's always a lot of good work out there to look at. And I'd rather be looking at this right now. I think I think it's wonderful that you've brought so much attention to work that wasn't unknown, I would say, but you've allowed us to see what these women went through. And they had no champions. The men had so many champions. You know, between Harold Rosenberg, who we haven't discussed, who lived to promote de Kooning, and Clem and Pollock, and they each had a horse in the race.
One of the stories that I felt was important in my book that, you know, you say the women didn't have champions. Well, Grace had Frank O'Hara as a champion.
That's true.
Which was really incredible because Frank had, when he went back to the Museum of Modern Art to work in the international program, from that moment, Grace was represented in all of the important traveling shows. And I don't think it was because, I mean, he and Grace were the closest of friends, but I don't think that was the only reason.
I don't think it was the reason at all. Because Alfred Barr supported her early on.
And the Rockefellers did. But that was a really interesting relationship because he made sure, in fact, with his first book of poetry that was published by Barney Rossett, Barney wanted someone else, I think it was Bob Goodnow, to do the cover. And Frank, in letter after letter, said, no, I really want Grace to do it. And then Barney would write back and say, well, you know, I think we should have. There must have been, I don't know, maybe 10 letters going back and forth between the two of them. And Frank stuck to his guns, and Grace did the cover for it. And so he was a powerful voice who was working for her.
A great person to have on your side.
Yes. Yeah, that was one of the other things in this book that I really enjoyed. The focus has not just been on a few men, but there were a lot of figures, other artists, other writers, composers who made up the personality of that period, who were fantastic to write about, so much fun. And without them, there is no story. And oftentimes, especially when you're focusing on just one person, it becomes difficult to include all of these other peripheral figures. But that's why I kind of made a stew of this book and threw everyone in there, because
it's hard to pull it together, though. Weaving all that material together.
But
did you find that very difficult?
Did you
Did you constantly think, where am I going to put Morton Feldman or John Cage?
Because
Where is he going?
No, because they entered at a certain moment. It was really kind of, it wasn't that difficult, to be honest with you. There was a certain chronology to it, you know. In the movement, I know that some people have observed that there was sort of not plotting, but the earlier movement was slower. And then all of a sudden it exploded. And indeed it did, because that's what happened. You know, the book follows that. There was, you know, a few very serious, dedicated artists. And then 1950 happened, and, you know, the world changed, and that sort of heavy post-war period, you know, that soul-searching post-war period had ended. And the go-go 50s consumerism had started. And then the various GIs who'd been studying, you know, wild things. I mean, to imagine that the government paid for Larry Rivers to study music, and, you know, it's just so much fun to think about that. The government paying Larry Rivers to do anything. But so they all, you know, they all came together, and it was this, you know, pardon the cliche, this incredible flowering. So I tried to get all of that in there, and hopefully, and you know, it was as if they were knocking on the door and saying, it's my turn to come into the story, and there they would be.
Did you find that you liked writing about one of the women more than the others?
No, I really didn't. I thought I might, because at the beginning, you know, having met Grace, and so the story began with her, I thought she would be the one that I would favor maybe, but I didn't. And then Elaine, I felt instinctively, you know, I felt culturally in every way kind of attuned to her.
Because she was a writer?
Yeah, because she was a writer. Yeah, I felt like I understood her and her love of portraiture. When I was an art student, I really loved portraits. You know, I'm not at all good at flights of fancy. And so I appreciated where she was coming from, you know, that she was writing portraits, both in words and in painting. And but then, you know, as I met all of them and got to know all of them, I really enjoyed each and every one. And by the end of the book, I hated to give any of them up. Mm-hmm. So anyway, did you have a favorite? You knew them all.
I think I was most moved by Helen Frankenthaler because I never realized before that Clem never wrote about her.
But you had written about her.
I had written about
her
her myself.
Yeah.
I know. I must have known. But, you know, I took down his volumes. I was in disbelief that she dated this man. She met him in 1950, and his first collection comes out in 61. He doesn't mention her, and she is a movement that he extols after color field painting. And I just thought, you know, he was such an underminer. Mm-hmm. How did she get any work done? It's amazing she was ambulatory.
Yeah.
And then, so I just thought it took remarkable strength in that era. I'm wondering, do you think the fact that they were all abstract painters or semi-abstract painters made it easier for them to assert themselves?
I think it might have.
Because you couldn't segregate paintings according to male or female subjects.
I think that might have helped because if they had started out with you know, either a kind of a semi-abstraction or figurative works or landscapes or whatever, they would have been more easily pigeonholed, I think. Mm-hmm. But I think abstract painting was a language that, you know, transcended gender.
It transcended gender. Mm-hmm. Which is very interesting. And now, of course, artists want to embrace gender and difference and autobiography. We're at a very different moment. But it's interesting because if you compare a Grace Hartigan next to, let's see, whose work does it next to James Brooks, for instance.
Yeah.
You couldn't say which one was painted by a man and which one was painted by a woman.
Or there's a Larry Rivers upstairs, a really great Larry Rivers. I don't know if you saw it. I think it's from 1960. Almost completely abstract. And that you couldn't say, that could have been by Grace. You know, it would be impossible if it was a man or a woman. And even though people would say that, you know, sometimes Joan in her moments would accuse Helen of painting like a woman, I don't think that you could really, if you look at a Rothko or a Frankenthaler, I don't really think you could say one was done by a man and one was done by a woman. And definitely not one of Joan's paintings. You know, the energy in her work, maybe the later works, but then, you know, then you've got Monet. And so, you know, you can't say hers are more lyrical than his work.
And you really romanticize the 50s. I do too. I do too. But I'm not sure that the art world was better when everyone was starving.
Yeah, I know. It's
you know, it's tempting. It is. It was Bohemia's last flare in the United States, and it was an incredibly romantic movement, and clearly no one was in it for the money.
Right.
But I still think no one ever really became an artist to make money.
No.
I mean, that would be a foolish thing to do.
It was a foolish thing to do. Right. It was a foolish thing to do. And no one even considered it. I mean, for the first...
No, but now even I don't think anybody goes into art for that reason.
I'm sure some people do.
No. I mean, there's so many easier ways to make money than being an artist.
Yeah,
anything is easier, basically.
Yeah.
So, you know, I don't think people get into it for that reason.
Yeah.
That's all I wanted to say. So I feel like artists, some of you might disagree. I know there are a lot of critics here, but I feel like artists are as earnest now as they were in the 50s. Everybody's doing their best. Nobody ever set out to make a bad painting.
Yeah.
And
no, I agree with that.
But the 50s does have, it still is mesmerizing.
Yeah, it is.
Why is that?
I think it's because it was the first real revolution. You know, we've had political revolutions in the United States, but this was the first artistic revolution. And it was so, it was, you know, I mean, I say over and over again in the book, but it changed the history of art for the Western world, and I suppose beyond. And I think that that's part of it, that revolutions are always romantic. And this one was romantic because everyone was in it together. You know, in a talk I give for this book, I say that women weren't daughters of the revolution, they were soldiers in the revolution. And that was really true, that they were in it completely, you know, with up to here with the same sacrifices, as dedicated in their art, you know, prowling the same bars and the same streets as the men at all the wrong hours. So they were completely in it. And I think that's just what's plus it's beyond painting and sculpting, you know, the music of that time, like the 5-spot anecdote where they're there at night watching, you know, and Billie Holiday creeps in and starts singing. I mean, that's just irresistible stuff. So, and they're there, you know, and not making a big deal of it, although they all loved Billie Holiday. So I think that it's a fascinating time. And as you say, it was kind of I think of it as the last pure moment in art, you know, when artists were kind of left alone to do their work and without heavy-handed criticism. A lot of the critics that wrote about art in the 50s were actually other artists. You know, when you look at the little initials of who wrote the piece. In Art News, it would be Fairfield Porter, or it would be Frank O'Hara, or it would be, you know, one of the pals. And so the criticism was very gentle.
They created the art and they were the audience for the art.
Right. Yeah, and they created the dialogue.
Everyone always says that when you went to a Merce Cunningham performance in that era, you knew everyone in the audience. And it was the same people from one performance to the next. And the people who were creating the art were supporting their... Oh, we'd love to have the audience.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry, we got carried away.
Questions? Anybody questions? Observations? Criticisms? Protests?
Yeah. Oh, I think we need a...
And can you say your name before you ask the question, please? Thanks.
Yes, hi, I'm Helen's niece, Ellen Eisman, and I just want to thank you so much for a really beautiful presentation. And I'm very proud of my aunt wherever she is looking down, and I'm sure
you're Helen's niece.
Ellen,
my mom was Marjorie Frankenthaler, her older sister, and also probably her best friend too.
Yeah.
So we're very close, and I'm very moved by tonight's presentation. I just wanted to ask, because you spoke about the pendulum inevitably swinging, and I just wondered, 40 or 50 years from now, do you think these artists are still going to be talked about and kind of revered as pioneers and so forth, or will other names have taken their place?
It's hard to say, it's hard to predict, but I can't see if anybody in 40 or 50 years are still talking about Bill de Kooning and Jackson Pollock. I would hope that they would still be talking about Helen Frankenthaler and Lee Krasner and Elaine de Kooning and Grace Hardigan and Joan Mitchell, because I hope that through this book and through the shows that are going to be coming up, there's a big Mitchell retrospective coming up, and the exhibitions that Museum of Modern Art had and the Denver Museum had, I hope that these women are taking their rightful place in history and that they'll remain there. So I can't see why they wouldn't, based on the quality of their work.
Definitely. The 50s are seen as the heroic era in American painting. Mm-hmm. And it's always foolish to predict who will last. Yeah. But I think they'll all be exhibited forever.
Yeah. 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 I'm sure she's watching this somewhere.
Do we have a question over here?
Jim, yeah.
I'm Jim Levis. I'm quite curious about your perspective on the issue of the power of the last name. As of the 5 artists, 4 of them had their own name identity. Mm-hmm. Elaine de Kooning being the outsider in that regard. What, in your mind's eye, if any, challenges do you think that presented to Elaine then and now?
Mm-hmm. I think that it probably, in some ways, the name recognition probably opened some doors, but in the art world. But I think that ultimately it might have hurt Elaine, because she's always a wife of, with the name de Kooning. And Elaine was so strong in every way in her life and in her art and in her writing that Elaine Freed, I think, would have done just fine, without being Elaine de Kooning. So I think in her case it might have hurt. But then again, I have to say I can't even imagine her not being Elaine de Kooning. That's who she is. So I don't know, but I think it might have hurt. What do you think? What is your thought?
It's a good name to have.
Yeah.
Mary de Kooning. I'm changing my name. But it's interesting how many women in the history of art attach themselves to great artists. And I was just saying to somebody, the only one I think who really surpassed her husband, I know this is dangerous, is Frida Kahlo. Who possibly surpassed Diego Rivera. I mean, he's a great artist. I don't mean to turn it into a contest, but she attached herself to somebody who was well known at the time and was ignored by much of the art world. And many women attached themselves. Georgia O'Keeffe attached herself to Stieglitz. Mary Cassatt married the brother of Manet. And I just think there were so few opportunities for women that they went wherever they could and wherever the opportunities were. And that was one way to not necessarily even enhance their careers, but to be part of the art world, to be part of the conversations. And that's what they lived for.
Yeah. But it's funny, this whole idea of attaching themselves to a more powerful man. Elaine and Lee were married to big figures, but the next generation, Grace, Joan, and Helen, even though Helen was dating Clem and married Bob Motherwell, I didn't think, when I was writing about them, I never thought of them as getting a boost by those relationships at all.
No.
And I think that, especially for Grace and Joan, I mean, the men in their lives didn't help one bit. Barney might have, just as through Joan's life, Barney was always a sounding board and kind of like a brother, Barney Rossett. But the other men in their lives, if anything, were kind of a drag. I hope that's not unfair.
Definitely.
But
yeah. So do you think they were pointing more toward the future? What is the? But now it seems like it's a different situation altogether. Whereas women don't have to necessarily be out there alone on the cliff if they're an artist. I mean, they can find some comfortable social role as well.
Yeah, I think Grace called it a congenial partner.
A congenial partner. That's nice to have.
Yeah, it's very handy. Does anyone else have any questions?
I was going to ask you a question.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Unless there's I noticed, I mean, there are so many foundations now. There are so many artist foundations. And I was wondering, did you work closely with the foundations and was everybody supportive of you?
Yes, they were. And I'm not just saying that because they're here. No, they
How
were.
does that work? I mean, do they have all the papers there? And
the Mitchell Foundation and
Time to
the
eat
Frankenfeller
soup.
Foundation have,
I hope you have a great
incredible
evening.
treasure troves of
Thanks for
primary
coming and
material,
saying
which are,
hello whenever I,
it's as good as, well, not as good
painted
as sitting
everything.
down with a living person, but pretty close.